our speaker, we're tapping into the resources of the National Catholic Recorder one more time. Maybe we'll do it a few more. But anyway, Michael Sean Winters is a journalist and a writer who covers politics and events in the Roman Catholic Church for the NCR. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Catholic University of America at its Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. He's also a correspondent for the Tablet, the London-based international weekly magazine that I read myself, and I find it very interesting when he writes as a U.S. citizen for the British. He has written a book on Catholics and how, the title of the book is Left at the Altar, how Democrats lost the Catholics and how Catholics can save the Democrats. He also has a biography of Reverend Jerry Falwell, God's right hand, how Jerry Falwell made God a Republican and baptized the American right. It was published by Harper in January 2012. On Catholic issues, Michael is frequently referenced as pro-life, pro-labor, pro-Israel, and he described himself in that regard as Ella Grasso, an Ella Grasso Democrat. She's the governor of Connecticut. On Catholic issues, he is frequently ranged in opposition to the conservative cultural warrior approach, favoring positions that are both orthodox and pastoral. Today, as you know, he's going to speak to us about synodality, the challenge that faces the church today from the way that Pope Francis is pushing us toward synodality. And he will also remind us or bring to our attention what needs to be changed within the church and within ourselves if we're going to have true synodality in the church. I'm very happy to present today Michael Sean Winters.
I am going to have to keep, because I've got all these microphones running around, I've got to keep my glasses on. So if I look over, my glasses like that, I'm not looking down the length of my nose at you. It's just I haven't figured out how to do this without knocking this off. One advice they give you in public speaking is never follow a legend. So the talk I've been asked to give today, and I know we're going to want to get to a lot of questions. First of all, I just want to say I'm deeply humbled and really excited to see such a large crowd. So the Spirit is active in the Archdiocese of Detroit, and that's good to know. And so I will take this word back to the National Catholic Reporter and to the people who read us. I also spoke to Chris White, our Rome correspondent, who was here in March to speak to this group, and he sends love and regards to everyone. We talk pretty much every morning. Journalists, it's glorified gossip, right? So we call first thing in the morning and gossip with each other. But I told him, he called me, I just arrived at the airport, and he said, sends his best. And most importantly, he said on the Hungary trip with the Holy Father looked great. So I was asked to talk about what are the challenges and then what we can do about it. And I think that there are three core challenges the church faces right now. One is obviously declining numbers. Mass attendance has dropped by half since 1970. Ryan Berge, who's a Baptist minister who teaches political science at Eastern Illinois University, who's really good on studying the data about religious observance and religious beliefs. A lot of people I don't trust, actually, in this area. I think there's a lot of hooey that is put around in terms of what Catholics do and do not believe in other religious, but he's someone I trust. And he wrote, in the early 1970s, about half of Catholics were weekly Mass attenders. Today, it's about 25%. And no, that's not a result of the pandemic. Attendance was down to 26% in 2018, long before the world had ever heard the word COVID-19. But he points out, and I found this interesting, that when you look at those who said that they never or seldom go to Mass, things get very interesting. In 2008 and 2012, it's pretty clear that this group was a point of strength for Democrats. However, between 2012 and 2016, what he calls pretty tectonic shifts were underway. Instead of the distribution being 15% plus for Democrats, it now becomes an even mix, about 42% for both parties. And those are the people who seldom go to church. So it's hard to imagine that that's a theological change because they weren't in church to hear the message from the pulpit. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, is what else is going on in the culture that changes these things. And by 2022, the numbers reverse, and there's a 15% advantage of Republicans among those who seldom go to church. Interestingly, among those who go weekly, it's about the same from 1970 to today. It's about 32%, 33% for Democrats, about 40% for Republicans, and 20% in independents. Second issue that I think plagues our church and presents itself as a challenge is polarization. Our church, like our society, is deeply divided. We're in an era, if you saw that little video that was distributed yesterday from this conference of bishops and theologians, the historian Robin Darling Young said, ours is an age of easy hostility. And that's true. And so, I don't have to tell you, Michigan is one of those states that went for Trump in 2016 and Biden in 2020. I shudder to think the kind of ads you had to watch. One good thing about living in a totally blue state like Connecticut, you don't get a whole lot of political ads because, there's no reason for a Republican to advertise in Connecticut. And the third problem is, of course, the loss of faith. And part of this is a loss of faith in ecclesial institutions, as there's a loss of faith in all institutions in American society, but also something deeper. And I think we have to admit that there's been a loss of faith that the tomb is empty, that people do not simply believe anymore that religion matters. You all are the exception. You got up on a Tuesday afternoon to come here and you're the exception. And that number, I saw another survey this week that said that it was down to about 20% of Americans list religion as the most important thing in their life. And it is the premise of our faith that if you believe the tomb is empty, that is the thing that changes everything. In fact, it's the only thing that changes everything. So with those three things, declining numbers, polarization, loss of faith, I'm reminded of the famous question posed to Mary Todd Lincoln. So, Mrs. Lincoln, other than that, how was the theater? I think to diagnose these challenges, we have to look back to some recent history. And one of the great blessings of my life was I was a student of John Tracy Ellis, who was the famous church historian at Catholic University, the University of San Francisco, and then back at Catholic U. And So that's where I always look back with a historical lens. And I think the most important thing, and Bill O'Brien was driving me around today, and you could see it as we drove in from the airport and through the neighborhoods. The most dynamic thing that happened in American Catholicism in the 20th century was the post-war move to the suburbs and to success. It was a geographic shift, and it was a socioeconomic shift. The ghetto that characterized the 19th century and early 20th century Catholic experience. In the ghetto, in the Catholic ghetto, you had a cultural Catholicism. If you had a Catholic school in the 1920s, you never had to get the Board of Education together to talk about the Catholic mission. The sisters brought the mission in with them, right? The neighborhood was defined. In the 1920s, if you were asked, where do you live? You would say, oh, Holy Trinity. Holy Redeemer, St. Bernadette's. And ghettos, we forget, produce their own excellences. Right? Like the Catholic ghetto had doctors, it had lawyers, it had, Fordham Law School opens in 1905. As a Catholic, you couldn't get into Harvard or Yale in 1905, but Fordham opened. In 1925, St. John's opens its law school. And Catholicism defined the rhythms. You didn't have to argue about it. You didn't have to, it was just, it was. And with the move to the suburbs, a couple things shift there. The first is, you're now going to be deciding, it's not just any suburb, it's a suburb in an increasingly affluent, increasingly consumer-oriented, consumer-driven, capitalist post-war society. So you are now not defined by living in St. Bernadette's neighborhood, but I drive a Ford, or I have a Camaro. The points of identity start to shift. There was an amazing letter that John Steinbeck, the novelist, sent to Adlai Stevenson. And he said, you know, if I wanted to get a country on its knees, I would give it too much stuff. In the ghetto, suffering was never far away. You were aware if there was an alcoholic in the family or in your neighbor's family. You were aware of the disabilities in your neighborhood, in your extended family, in your parish, in a way that we can overlook in suburban life. People can become isolated, right? It's now the nuclear family, not the extended family. Think of the pressure. We wonder why the divorce rate went up. The conservatives blame the sexual revolution. Pressure that used to be carried by an extended family with aunts and uncles and grandparents all around is now put on one man and one woman living off in a suburb. And most importantly, I think for us as Catholics, success becomes the goal of the American life. Professional success, family success, and we worship a God who's crucified. So all of a sudden, something gets weird in the Catholic imagination, and not just the Catholic imagination. There's a wonderful book I commend to you all by George Marsden, the great evangelical scholar at Notre Dame. He's retired now. But it was called The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And in the 1950s, the social critics were aware of the danger of marketing, of consumerism, of affluence. Right? We could have started with Luke 4. I come to preach good news to the poor. And we've become affluent. And so maybe the reason for the decline in religion in America is not more complicated than the fact that we don't even hear it anymore, because we're not poor. The effects of this demographic shift on religion are multiple, but two things, though separate, though different, are quite related. One is the reduction of religion to ethics. Now, this is an American norm, and it's the idea that if you have dogma involved in the public face, the wars of religion are going to break out. But we can all agree on ethics of what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a bad person, and this kind of stuff. I think that's no longer true, by the way, in American society about what counts as good and what counts as bad. But this was the dominant belief in the 50s. And the problem with that, obviously, is our ethical beliefs flow from the empty tomb and flow from the crucified. And they weren't meant to stand alone. And it turns out, especially on things like our sexual ethics in the church, they don't stand alone. They seem ridiculous. Secondly, and I think this has not gotten enough attention, and I think it's actually the most important thing that happens in this kind of psychological shift with the move to the suburbs. When you go from a cultural Catholicism to a non-cultural Catholicism, that non-cultural Catholicism is going to be more intellectual, more notional, more propositional. Believing is like these 5 things. It becomes a checklist. It's not a way of life. And this, I think, is deeply, deeply problematic for us as Catholics. I was very, very, I was blessed to have as one of my mentors Lorenzo Albacete. Lorenzo was this 300-pound Puerto Rican Monsignor. He was a total slob. Brilliant slob, oh my God. And chain smoker. So you'd always have like half of the ashes of a pack of Marlboros on his rabbi, and breakfast was there, anyway. But he was brilliant, and he would say, Mike, he was the only person who called me Mike. No one calls me Mike. Oh, Mike, you Americans, you always care about self-justification, but our Christian narrative is about sin and redemption. It's not about justification of the self. And I would wrestle with this, and then one day he was doing a debate in New York, in the aughts, so not too long after 9/11. And the issue that was being debated was, if someone is in custody who knows the location of a nuclear device that is set to go off in Midtown Manhattan, and we stipulate that torture is effective, we know it's not actually effective, but we're going to stipulate it is for purposes of this debate. Can you torture that person in order to get the location in time to defuse the bomb? And our friend Rick Hertzberg from The New Yorker, former speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, said, no, you can never torture. It's always wrong. It's ontologically wrong. You have killed your culture in the act of torture before the bomb goes off. There was somebody, I forget who, from the Bush administration who said, well, of course you torture the person and save millions of lives. And then Lorenzo went last, and he goes, oh, they said, what was the Catholic opinion? He goes, oh, I can't speak for the whole Catholic opinion, but I think, of course you torture him, but then you must go to confession. Now, it's not hard to see the opportunities for hypocrisy in this worldview, but it's also obvious that there's an enormous sympathy with the human condition in that answer. The confessional exists to exercise sympathy with our human condition, right? It doesn't exist to condemn. It exists to reconcile. Recently, you may have read, I edited a book. I'm reluctant to recommend it because it's $200. And that's a lot for a book. But the parish should buy one. Father, where did Father go? Okay, the parish should have one. It's a handbook on Vatican II, and it's edited by Catherine Clifford and Massimo Fagioli. 2 brilliant scholars. Massimo is also, I've been so blessed to get to know him as a good friend. And he said this about this post-war dynamic, because it wasn't just in the U.S., and it wasn't just from the city to the suburbs. You also had Italians and Spaniards and Latin Americans going from overwhelmingly Catholic cultures to more religiously diverse cultures, like the U.S. And he writes, quote, religion ceased to be associated primarily with specific denominations and denominational creeds, and came to be associated with broad ethical and political trends along liberal and conservative political lines. Now, this is very important. The opposite of Catholic is not Protestant. The opposite of Catholic is sectarian, right? The gospel of Jesus Christ that we just heard proclaimed can come to fruition in a liberal heart or a conservative heart, in a suburban heart, in an urban and a rural heart, in the north, in the south, in the east, and the west. This is what it means to be Catholic. And There's a beautiful line by Jacques Maritain who said that the real challenge of Catholic intellectual maturity, we're all born with one kind of a heart. You're born with a liberal heart or a conservative heart. And anyway, you can't do anything about it. It's the way you were born. And the key is to attune yourself and acquire and learn from the wisdom that inheres and belongs to the kind of heart you were not born with. That's a key to overcoming polarization, right there. Pay attention to the kind of wisdom that is born in the argument with a person who you don't want, you really, your first instinct is you want to hit them. But is there wisdom in what they say? There may be venom in what they say. There may be bigotry in what they say. But is there a possibility when you clear that away that there might be a kernel of wisdom that they're trying to get at? I think many Catholics, we lost that prior sense of solidarity with our co-religionists, and again became defined more and more, and there's ample social science data that will show this, and our identity became defined by our political beliefs. And instead of subjecting our political beliefs to scrutiny in light of our religious beliefs, we now cherry pick the scripture passages that conform to our political ideas, which we've arrived at by another means. And the post-conciliar landscape, especially at elite levels, at the level of colleges and universities and professors and theologians, offered many, many opportunities in the post-conciliar period for conflict. Ad infra conflicts within the church, and also on the outside. You see in the 1960s and 70s the real start of the culture war politics, right? You know, before Donald Trump, there was Pat Buchanan. Before Pat Buchanan, there was before Bush, George Wallace. Thank you, George Wallace, who, unless I'm mistaken, carried Michigan in the 1972 or 68 primaries, right? I mean, this is a reality that we have to. Trump didn't invent this stuff, right? He had the foresight to be a TV host for 10 years before running on it, and is a better salesman. So. And the other thing, so now that we've been talking about these changes in the Catholic community, as well, the ambient culture that we're moving into is shaped by certain Protestant ethics that just are not, that made it harder for Catholics to hold on to their identity. One of the great books that I always recommend, and it's not $200. In fact, it's no longer in print, so you can find it cheap online, is H. Richard Niebuhr's, so the brother of the more famous Reinhold, his book, Christ and Culture. And it presents a taxonomy of different ways of how the relationship of Christ and culture are resolved. And I love this quote he has on Luther. He says, quote, "Luther's answer to the Christ and culture question was that of a dynamic dialectical thinker. Its reproductions by many who called themselves his followers were static and undialectical. They substituted two parallel moralities for his closely related ethics. As faith became a matter of belief rather than the fundamental, trustful orientation of the person in every moment toward God, so the freedom of the Christian man became autonomy in all the special spheres of culture." I want to repeat that. As faith became a matter of belief, propositional, notional, rather than the fundamental, trustful orientation of the person in every moment toward God, so the freedom of the Christian person, he wrote man, but the Christian person became autonomy in all the special spheres of culture. It is a great error to confuse the parallelistic dualism of separated spiritual and temporal life with the interactionism of Luther's gospel of faith in Christ working by love in the world of culture. I would submit that the rise of autonomy as a central organizing value in modern society is surely the most anti-Christian development of the modern era. We cannot explain, to take a current example, why the American church, we were talking about this earlier, next year is the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment. And if you want to know why the American church has not responded to that, every other culture has done a better job than us. We are literally the worst It is because we like our independence. We're Americans. We like to be independent. And the key to get out of the environmental problem at its most basic level is to understand how dependent we are on each other and on the natural world. So when I hear autonomy, when I hear anything that, if I smell libertarianism, I start to scratch. Anyway, so where am I here? Instead of and what was the Catholic response to this? Unfortunately, we blended in. And instead of articulating a very distinctly Catholic politics of solidarity and opposition to libertarianism, we started to accept the libertarianism that comes with whichever political party we belong to. So if you're a Republican, the libertarianism on economics and taxes is fine. If you're a Democrat, the libertarianism of the pro-choice position is fine. And we never articulated the consistent ethic of life could have developed into a consistent ethic of solidarity, and it didn't. And in fact, even as we've seen in the last year since Roe was overturned, the consistent ethic of life is held by no one anymore. I hold it. I feel very lonely this last year in holding it. Now, this is an old story. Augustine wrote, "The will abandons what is above itself and turns to what is lower. It becomes evil. Not because that is evil to which it turns, but because this turning itself is wicked." Close quote. City of God, books 12, chapter 6. And to go back to Niebuhr, he writes of this passage in one of the finest sentences of the entire book. Quote, "This primal sin, which is more significantly named the first sin of man than the sin of the first man, may be variously described as falling away from the word of God, as disobedience to God, as living according to man, and as pride. For what is pride but the craving for an undue self-exaltation? In this era that we're describing, self-exaltation is becoming normative. Turn on the TV almost any day. Whether it's a talk show, whether it's an interview with an athlete, whether with a star. Why did we start thinking that people who were effective at bobsledding or in movie acting should be asked their political opinions? Why, this is insane. Don't put me on a bobsled either. I mean, it works both ways. So, this affluence that we have, this self-exaltation, it leads to a very easy idolatry. We like our gods. We all have false gods, and we like them, and we protect them. I think one of the reasons, let me skip over that. That's going to be a rabbit hole for us. I do think it's an interesting thing that, and there's a variety of reasons, and some of those reasons go back to way earlier centuries. That in this era of the 60s and 70s, sex becomes such a dividing line, such a lightning rod in our culture, and in our understanding, our self-understanding as Catholics, as liberal Catholics or conservative Catholics. And so part of this is the latent Jansenism of the Irish Catholic Church. Anybody here Irish? Okay. My mother, bless her heart, she was Irish. She was a Jansenist. She didn't know why, but it turns out, Irish Jansenists, the Irish clergy had gone to study in the French seminaries in the 17th century, and they drank in Jansenism. And Jansenism had a lot of different theories there, but the key was, if you don't enjoy sex, you're going to heaven, right? I mean, that was what it was about, right? Okay. And this, of course, combined to the ambient culture. There's still a latent Puritanism in American culture, and it gets misplaced at different times. And so the left and the Catholic basically says on the sexual issues, well, it's just ridiculous. We're not even going to consider what the church has to say. And the conservative response is to say this exhausts the gospel. This is what it means to be a Catholic. Is that Catholicism is now an upper middle class club for people with conservative sexual ethics. Well, count me out. that's not actually as I understand it. So this undermines, I think, both our Catholic imagination, and it undermines and impoverishes our Catholic ecclesiology and our understanding of what it does mean to belong to the body of Christ. And we on the left, the right was making it moralistic. We on the left were kind of losing sight of our humanistic tradition, our both-and tradition, and the Catholic instinct to unite, to try to find things, not the either-or, but the both-and. Like that's something that is still waiting to be done in terms of sexual ethics and what the church has to teach about family and family life, and has for centuries. There's also in these years two simultaneous developments. I'm going to talk briefly about the socioeconomic changes. So in the Northeast, the mills started to close. And where I'm from, we had thread mills in northeastern Connecticut. And in the late 50s and early 60s, they started to move to South Carolina. And then in the 90s, they moved to Nicaragua, and now they've moved to Vietnam. Because capital realizes it's mobile. And capital becomes disassociated from any sense of obligation to the community. Organized labor begins to lose its influence. Organized labor is, I believe, in American life, the principal instrument for solidarity alongside churches. Full stop. Nothing has been worse for American political life in the last 50 years than the loss in the influence of organized labor. In the 1950s, every bishop would know the local labor leaders, right? Today, who do they know? They know the rich people who can write the checks. You also have this emergence of Ayn Rand in the popular culture, but also Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and a real libertarian response to what we know as Keynesian economics, the New Deal approach to the relationship of politics and values and society. The idea that government should exist to pursue a common good. And what the libertarians very effectively do, there's a new book, I have not read it, but my colleague Tom Roberts, who many of you know was the longtime editor of NCR, just reviewed Mary Jo McConaughey's book on God, and I forget what the title is, but it's about the influence of right-wing money on the Catholic Church. And this is, profoundly problematic because they introduce, Keynes was not Catholic, but you look at post-war societies, and whether in Europe or in the US, and the social contract was very consistent with Catholic social teaching. Everybody had to get ahead. You had a lot of public power. There was, as Catholics have always taught, the church has always taught, that politics is a good thing. Government is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. Doesn't mean it can't be abused. Of course it can. But you need it. And all of a sudden you get this idea, quite unique, quite anti-Catholic, no, politics is bad. Remember Ronald Reagan saying, the scariest 9 words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Right? It was funny, and if you've ever gotten stuck in a bureaucracy sometimes that's not making any sense, you can be sympathetic with it, but it's a really profoundly anti-Catholic and anti-common good statement. So this goal to reduce public power, guess what? What does that leave the vacuum open for? Private power. Look at the levels of economic inequality in American life since 1980. They go through the roof. You also have, let's take the last example of Keynesian's last breath was the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. Now, another thing Reagan used to say, there was a war on poverty and poverty won. No, it didn't. There were a lot of complex things going on in the late 60s. And one of the things was the blue-collar jobs started to go away. And so African-American wages, which had been going up after, at the end of World War II, all of a sudden start to come down. Combined with that And for a lot of reasons, including, the endemic systemic racism of ours and other societies, it was easier for white blue-collar workers to transition, for many of them to transition to a white-collar economy than for African Americans. The other thing that happened is some African Americans moved to the suburbs. The African American ghetto had its excellences, it had its doctors and its lawyers and all that. Well, when they moved out, because the Housing Rights Act allowed them to move out, guess what? You just took the social capital out of those inner city neighborhoods. You had the rocks of that neighborhood. A totally unforeseen consequence that wreaked havoc. Those two dynamics created what we know as the inner city, neighborhood, and all the pathologies that grew up out of that, that we've still not really figured out how to address or how to solve. So all these complex socioeconomic developments are going on at the same time, and the church is trying to make its way through here. And I think by and large, until the last 15 years or so, the church was always on the side of the angels in those fights. The church was always standing up for civil rights for African Americans. For not every Catholic was, but our bishops were dynamite on economic issues. When you go back and you reread the economic pastoral on economics in the 1980s, it reads very well. John Carr worked for many years for the U.S. Bishops' Conference. There's not an American who's done more to help poor people in this society than John Carr, who worked for 30 years at the U.S. Bishops' Conference. And I'm sad to say, and Bishop Gumbleton will remember this, about 2009, 2010, the U.S. bishops wanted to do a pastoral letter on poverty, and it was so bad, it was rejected on the floor. They couldn't agree on poverty. So I want to keep moving along here. We're going to see, I just gave you a blessing. You missed my whole section on deconstructionism. But I think its time has come, if anyone asks you. But I want to use this quote from Kathy Caveney. Again, when you read an article, if you see Kathy Caveney's name on an article or book, get it. Just stop what you're doing and read it. And she did a book called On Prophecy, Against Prophecy, or something like that. It was really good. And it was basically condemning this kind of knee-jerk sense that we have in American life of the Jeremiad, the denunciation. And she said, look, in most political issues, actually, that denunciation thing doesn't help. What helps is sitting down and saying, well, how do you view it? How do I view it? Okay, can we find a common agreement? But she had this really smart paragraph in there. Quote, for the Puritans, the breach of the covenant was their prevailing sins, which were more or less uncontroversial. The penalty was the loss of material prosperity. In our era, however, it seems that this structure is completely reversed. The uncontroversial covenantal obligation is to secure the nation's economic and military well-being. Political parties that do so are rewarded with the opportunity to implement their own contested vision of what counts as virtue and vice. I think that's a really smart insight that may be about to turn. So her idea is, elections really are about economics. But if you win, you get to do your social agenda. So if you're a Democrat and you win because the economy's good right now and you're in the incumbent and they're going to reward you for that, you get to do what you want in terms of gay rights, in terms of abortion rights, social spending, whatever. And if you're a Republican and you win because of the economy, you get to do the opposite. But those things are not what people are really voting on. I think we may be in a moment where that's changing. And I think it's dawning on us, we'll find out next year, that the president does not have a whole lot to say about whether the economy is going to be doing great or doing bad. Like, we're in this fight that they're having over the debt ceiling. It's really important we get this right? Because of the rising interest rates, you have this crunch on the monetary side. If you also have that on the budgetary side, we could very well tip into a recession. And recessions are really bad. Most of us are probably doing okay. They'll be difficult for us, but they're not a hurdle. For poor people, recessions are really bad. Right? Anytime you have an economic downturn, the people who pay the price are always the poorest. But I feel we're at a time, and we're moving into a time when, frankly, both parties are so repugnant and so defined by what's worst in them and by their extremes, and the middle's been hollowed out, that Caveney's perception may be changing, and actually cultural issues may be the thing, and that's really ugly, because the last time our American political system had that kind of deep-seated cultural fight that went all the way down, it was the Civil War. Democracies are really good at negotiations over interests. I want to raise the minimum wage to $15. You don't want to raise it at all. We can compromise at $12.50. You couldn't compromise on slavery. Either this person was born free or they weren't. So all these things we've discussed germinating in the 60s and 70s, what else goes on here? We're receiving Vatican II. Or not. And it turns out, much as John Paul II tried to convince us all, look, it's done, and we're going to have a synod in 1985, and here's the Code of Canon Law, and here's the Catechism, guess what? It takes 100 years to receive a council, and we're only about halfway there. It also turns out that other parts of the world were receiving the council very differently from the way we were receiving it here in America. It also turns out that we in America received a really, I think, falsified understanding of who John Paul was and what he was trying to do because we listened to George Weigel. And that was a mistake. It's always a mistake to listen to George Weigel. I shouldn't say that. That is uncharitable, I know, but I think it's true. So there's a great book, I reviewed it last year by Massimo Borghese, not Massimo Fagioli, Borghese, called, what's the name of it? It will come to me. But it looks at how Richard John Neuhaus, Michael Novak, and George Weigel systematically misinterpreted John Paul II to an American audience, and did so successfully, including to many of our bishops. And this is really important to understand. John Paul II was no friend of unrestrained, spread eagle capitalism. That is not who he was. You also, as I mentioned earlier, Pat Buchanan, I think picks up that George Wallace thing and carries it forward, kind of John the Baptist to Donald Trump. You have the emergence of Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich and the moral majority. Think about this. In the 1980s, the face of religion in America is Jerry Falwell. In the 1960s, it was Dr. King and William Sloane's Coffin and the Berrigans. There had been a decline. The 90s, you get Judith Butler at Berkeley. She's nuts. I don't know why anybody ever listened to this professor. You have the Clintons embrace neoliberalism. NAFTA was signed by Bill Clinton, not by Ronald Reagan. You have the rise of cable TV, which is a giant invitation to food fights over politics. You have, obviously, the sex abuse crisis starts to emerge as something, demonic in the life of our church. And in the aughts, it starts with 9/11. So all of a sudden, no wonder young people don't want anything to do with religion if the face of it is so fanatical. You have the Iraq War, where again, the neocons. Ask them about John Paul II. John Paul II tried to prevent George Bush from going to war in Iraq and failed. You have the economic meltdown in 2008 and all the missed opportunities that follow from that. And I think we as Catholics, again, had lost what was distinctive. And here I want to say he just died. And de mortuis nil nisi bonum, don't speak ill of the dead. But I want to do more than that. I want to say really good words about Joseph Ratzinger. Not such a fan of Cardinal Ratzinger, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But as Pope, he had some beautiful and powerful teachings. He was a horrible administrator. He made some terrible decisions. The whole thing on the Latin Mass was nuts. Okay? But he had some beautiful, beautiful teachings. And I think not just at the theoretical level, but also remember those 3 books he did on Jesus of Nazareth. And I want to quote from that, and we're at 2, and I want to get to questions. So I'm going to finish with this section with this quote, and then I'm going to give very quickly what we can do about this and get to the synodality point. And this is Ratzinger as Benedict. And he's discussing whether the tomb was empty, which is where we started. Jesus would be a failed religious leader who, despite his failure, remains great and can cause us to reflect. But he would then remain purely human, and his authority would only extend so far as his message to us is of interest to us. He would no longer be a criterion. The only criterion left would be our own judgment in selecting from his heritage what strikes us as helpful. In other words, we would be alone. Our own judgment would be the highest instance. Only if Jesus is risen can anything really new have occurred that changes the world and the situation of humankind. Only if Jesus is risen has anything really new occurred in the world. And I would submit, if I had been here in 2012, new and Catholic Church would not have come into the same sentence. And then something happened. They elected Pope Francis, who had a very different experience of receiving Vatican II, had a very different experience of American power, had a very different experience of church. And first as pastor, and we saw this the first night when he came out. Remember what he did? He asked us to pray. And what did he do? The Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be. Every kid knows those prayers. Then as a teacher, I'll tell you a story about the synod. I get a call from a bishop who was at for the synod on the family. And he had given an intervention, and he was trying to say classic American construction. Well, the doctrine has to be clear, but then we apply it mercifully. And that really wasn't what Francis was saying. What Francis is saying is mercy is the doctrine. And this was somebody who loved Francis, and he did, but habitually we think a certain way, and Francis said, no. The pastoral is not derivative of the doctrinal. It's coextensive with the doctrine. It's the both and. And then finally, this, I think, led to his most significant reform, which is synodality. And again, if you saw that little video, again, Robin Darling Young, she's so smart. She's a patristic scholar. And she said, what we may need most in the church right now is the ability to listen attentively to one another. And that's really hard. Hostility is easy. Listening is hard. And so I don't know what it's been like here in the Archdiocese of Detroit to be involved or not involved in the synod. But find ways to get involved. You can even do it online. If your parish isn't doing it, if your diocese isn't doing it, you can go online and join groups that are and they had that groups, Region 16 they called it, which was, the non-geographic region that had New Ways Ministry and all sorts of groups that had been homeless in the church. They had a region for them. But this is a truly hopeful thing. People are being asked for the first time the question, so what's it like to be a Catholic for you? And I don't have all the answers to that, but I can tell you what it's been like for me, and you can do it, and that something good is going to come of this. And if nothing else, if it lowers the temperature and it allows us, that person who just drove into the church parking lot with a Trump bumper sticker, loves the Eucharist the way I love the Eucharist, I want to find out how he or she does that, because I don't get that. But it's not my place to judge that person. The Lord gave lots of assignments to the disciples. He never asked anybody for help with judgment. Never once. One thing, price of admission. If you want to help overcome polarization and be part of synodality, the cost of admission is you have to be willing to call out your side. It is so easy to call out the other side. It's so easy to call back a previous century. If you're a Democrat, your homework is the next time you're with a room full of Democrats, stand up and say, well, as a Catholic, I disagree with you on this. I don't care what the this is. But honestly, Mayor Koch used to say, if you agree with me on 80% of the things, of the issues, vote for me. If you agree with me 100% of the time, go see a shrink. So surely our faith allows us to, whatever political party you belong to, surely there is something that you should be willing, and that has to be seen as an acceptable thing. Like, party orthodoxies are bad things. Parties shouldn't be orthodox. There was orthodoxy at Nuremberg. Shouldn't be party. When the Democratic Convention in 1968 grew ugly, and Mayor Daley was standing up there giving the middle finger to my Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff, that's good for democracy. Find common action with the other side. When you live in an ideological age, ideas may not be where you're going to find common ground, but common activity may be. And that can be charitable. Everybody, Republicans and Democrats can both help feed the poor. Not just to feed the poor, but we need to learn from the faith of the poor. At the border, Bishop Flores, who was here in Detroit for several years as an auxiliary, and Sister Norma will say, come help with our respite centers for the migrants, but work for 2 weeks before you talk to us about it. Just work. Move cans around, help bathe people, help get new clothes distributed. Help build up the instruments of solidarity. Again, unions. Anything you can do. We were talking about helping get the Church-Labor Alliance going again. Ecumenical efforts. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, every bishop in America was involved in ecumenical affairs. Now, not so much. Insist on it. This is something to bring up at the synodal systems. I would submit we all have to learn again, cum petro et sub petro. The mark of Roman Catholic identity is communion with the Roman Pontiff. Now, I joined NCR in 2009. Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was not the most popular pope with the NCR readership. And I could have just come in and put the chip on my shoulder and said, yeah. Instead I said, you know what? There's a density to a Ratzinger sermon, and I'm going to try to get through them. And you know what? I found a great deal of beauty there. I didn't always agree with his decisions, didn't always agree with his theology, but there was always something beautiful that I could find that would speak to me. Finally, the incarnation has to be real to us. And I'm going to finish. I talked about my friend Monsignor Albacete, who I miss every day. And he was doing, before he died, it was his last, he was very involved with the Comunione Liberazione, and they would have this New York Encuentros. And he and Sean O'Malley, the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, would always go and do this talk. And they were talking, and they were old friends and had been through all sorts of nightmares. You can Google and find that if you do O'Malley, Albacete, New York Encuentro, the videos will come up and you'll just laugh. They're hilarious. And Sean was talking about, he had just been with the Holy Father, Pope Francis. You remember he brought this Council of Cardinals who he had to advise him. He brought them to Assisi. And one of the first stops he went to was the Hospital for Disabled Children. And the Holy Father had said that these children are the wounds of Christ. And Lorenzo said, I still get choked up about this. This is not a metaphor. They are the wounds of Christ, or there has been a disincarnation. This is the faith we have to reclaim. The wounds of Christ are throughout the city. We drove through some neighborhoods today where you could see the effects of it. It was not hard to see. You can find them in the richest enclaves and the poorest enclaves. But if we don't find and worship the wounds of Christ, what are we doing? So, my advice, what do? Find and worship the wounds of Christ and bring those into a synodal process. And we'll see where it goes. With that, I'd love to take your questions.